Hey y'all, I'm James Wright. Welcome to my shop, and today we're talking about cuts of lumber. How do you get them out of this? I've done a few videos over the years about how lumber comes out, what you should be looking for in the shape, but every time I get a few more questions, and so this one I want to do one that's kind of all together. In other words, we're going to start at the log and see how do we cut this to get different lumbers. But to do that, we first need to understand wood movement and how exactly does wood move. When a log dries, everything about it shrinks, but it doesn't change in length. Now, technically, yes, it changes a little bit, but not measurable and not enough that would make any difference for any woodworking. So the wood you have will never change lengthwise, but it will change in the other dimensions. Also, from the center of the wood out, it doesn't expand and contract that much this way. So it does a little bit, and there is a measurable amount from the center out, but it doesn't change quite as much as it does radially. This whole thing wants to shrink this way, and that's why you get these big checks or cracks. So as the wood dries, this ring gets shorter. And this middle ring also gets shorter, but because this middle ring is smaller, the movement right at the middle isn't going to be that much, and the movement way out here is going to be a lot. And so because of that, as this whole thing shrinks down in, you'll get these cracks developing. Now, when you're drying logs whole, you're going to run into these checks. But what happens if you cut the lumber out before you dry it? Are you still going to get checks in the end? So let's take a look at... So let's imagine we take the saw and we cut this right across the pith, right in the middle. And we're going to be left with this particular board right here just below the middle. This is what's called flat sawn. It's flat, straight across the board. So let's actually think about this from a movement perspective. If everything is shrinking from the outside, out here at the ends of the board, this section of the board is going to want to get thinner. But here towards the middle, this section of the board is want to get shorter that way. So you're going to have the board shrinking in on itself here, and on the outside it's going to be shrinking in that direction. And that's going to cause the board to cup. So this is that flat sawn board. You can see the pith would have been somewhere right around here, but you can see these rings that go all the way through the board, and as they come out here they tend to flatten out and almost go across the board. So at this point, the board is wanting to get thinner. This point, the board is wanting to get thinner in this direction. In this point, the board is wanting to get thinner this way. So what's going to happen is those rings will have a tendency to want to flatten out. So the tops of these will bend up this way, and you'll get a board that cups opposite direction of the growth rings. Then on top of that, you have a board that has a length. If the pith was 1 inch below the board at this end, and at this end the pith was 3 inches below the board, that means there's going to be a different tension on this end than there was on that end. That's going to cause the board to twist. So you're going to get all these factors coming together with how the wood actually shrinks. A bit of a side note, that could also be because the tree itself was resisting a force. If the tree was always bending in one direction, you cut it, it's going to want to release some of that pressure and bend back the other way. And that's one of the reasons why you don't like to use wood out of limbs, because all their life are resisting the downward pressure. And when you cut them, now they can release that pressure. So sometimes you're going to get boards that kind of pinch up and bind on you just because of where they were in the tree. But you can also get that just from the way they were cut from the wood. So flat sawn lumber is usually the least stable. So when you're going to look at your lumber, if you see those rings in the middle and they flatten out, you know you're probably going to get some warping as you bring them into your shop and they change humidity. But flat sawn lumber means you can get the most lumber out of it. There's very little waste. You can get a lot of lumber out of a log, and so it tends to be cheaper. It's easier, it's functional, and you get a cheaper product with it. But you can get a lot more out of it. So let's move on to the next quality, and right up here we have this. This is quarter sawn. It's a quarter of the board, and you would get this out of it. You would start by cutting the log in half, and then you would take each of those sections and cut them in half into quarters. And then from that you would pull out lumber. And some people will flip it back and forth and back and forth and back and forth each time, getting another piece out of it. And some people will just take these two pieces and then flat saw the rest. Because these two pieces here are some of the most stable in the whole board. So quarter sawn tends to be far more stable because it's basically a flat sawn board where you cut it at the pith. And so it is going to want to cup a little bit, but not quite as much. Here you're going to have the rings going from corner to corner, but they're going to flatten out a bit, not a whole lot. And the closer these rings get to going perfectly 90 degrees across the board, the more stable the board is going to be. It's going to want to shrink a little bit in its thickness, but it's not going to want to move that much in its width because this was the inside of the tree and this is the outside of the tree. So it's not going to change that much, and it's not going to change that much because this is thinner, and it's not going to change in length. So this is a really stable piece of wood. The problem is you don't get as big of pieces out of the board. You can only get at least half the tree in width, and then you're going to have a lot of ended up waste on each board. So it's a bit more costly, but it's going to be more stable and is a better wood to work with. On top of them, zoom in on my face here, like something like that. When you get quarter sawn lumber and the rings are running almost 90 degrees to the face of the wood, on some woods you can see the medullary rays, like this with the white oak. You get these bands coming through that kind of pop out and give you some texture. On lumbers that have curl in them, like this curly maple, you can actually see the fibers that crush up and you can get that texture in there. That curl or chatoyancy really pops out on quarter sawn lumber. So if you ever want to work with wild figure and things that look really cool, you're probably going to end up working with quarter sawn lumber because you can get things out of it that you just can't get out of any other cut. But when you really want quality and you're willing to pay for it, flat sawn and quarter sawn, they just won't cut it. In that case, you might want to go to riven lumber. Ooh la la, this is the Rolls Royce of lumber cutting. With riven lumber, the logs are usually split rather than cut. And so I'd put a froe and an axe in here and I would split out these pieces. And they would make these triangular pieces to begin with. Then I'd take those triangular pieces and I would cut out all the corners and I'd turn them into rectangular. But what that gives you is absolute perfect quarter sawn pieces out of riven wood. And when you rive a log to get lumber out of it, you actually end up splitting along the grain rather than cutting across it. And if this was twisted and you cut straight down, then you would be cutting through all the fibers. Like on this board, the grain comes up here, goes over, and comes back. As I'm cutting down, I'm slicing through all those fibers, so I'm not getting full strength. Some laws even say that if you make wooden rungs, they must be made out of riven lumber. That way you know the grain is going all the way through. Imagine this is just a whole bundle of straws. If I split them and split those straws off, I still have individual straws going from one end to the other. But if I cut it at an angle, I'm going to be slicing through all of those straws. So I'm not going to have one straw going from one end all the way to the other. But if I rive it, I'm going to have straws going all the way through. That's going to mean far more strength, far more stable. And if you have a ladder rung that you're going to be trusting your weight to, you want to have the best quality wood you can get out of it. But when you rive the lumber, you're usually ending up wasting more than half of it. So it's a wasteful piece, and it means it's going to be far more expensive to get the same price out of the log. So often riven lumber is going to be 4, 5, 6 times as much. And a lot of lumber yards aren't even going to touch riven lumber because it takes so much work. That's something that's really specialty. If you go to most lumber yards, you're either going to have the choice of flat sawn lumber or quarter sawn lumber. And some quarter sawn lumber is actually quarter sawn, and some are just the inside pieces of the flat sawn lumber that they'll be cut in half and sold as quarter sawn, which is perfectly fine. It has the same characteristics to it. If the project you're coming up needs something that's more stable, then you might want to spend that money for the quarter sawn lumber. If you want something that has all that figure, like in white oak, then it might be worth spending that extra to get the quarter sawn. But if you're building a deck out back or you're framing up a house, I don't care what the quality of the grain is on it. I'm just going to go get flat sawn lumber. And that's why almost all construction lumber is just simple, quick, flat sawn lumber. Sometimes you'll even get some with the pith running right through the middle and you'll have checks coming out of it. That's perfectly okay for some of those instances. But if I'm going to be making a dresser that everything's got to fit together and the pieces have to slide past each other, then I might not want flat sawn because it's going to change each season and each time it's going to warp and twist a little bit. I want something that's a little more stable, something that's a little bit more trustworthy, and I might be willing to spend the extra to get the quarter sawn lumber for that. But there's a simple trick you can do to get quarter sawn lumber for the price of flat sawn. If I went to the lumber yard and I found this particular piece of flat sawn, this one is a little bit too flat, but the board that might be right below it in the stack might actually have the rings very close to the pith. And in that case, I can grab that piece of flat sawn lumber, cut it in half, and now I've got 2 pieces of quarter sawn lumber. Ooh. Yeah, they're not going to be absolutely perfect. They're not going to be riven, but they're going to be better than just keeping it as a solid piece. So in that case, you might get quarter sawn lumber for the price of flat sawn, but that means you're going to have to put a little bit of work into it. Yeah, you're going to have to dig through the pile. And if you're working in construction lumber, you may be digging for a while. But if you're going to a local lumber yard and they don't mind you digging through it, some of them do, then you might be able to find some really nice quality lumber that is relatively close to quarter sawn that will be far more stable for the price of the flat sawn lumber. So sometimes it's worth being a bit picky and taking some time to dig through it. Now, word of advice. There are going to be people in the comments that get a bit pedantic about this, that I'm saying the wrong thing because there are technical quarter sawn lumber and riven lumber, and different sawmills will call things ever so slightly different things, and you are going to get some specific things that, ooh, that's not actually quarter sawn because it was flat sawn and you cut it. Don't be one of those people. In general, in basic, most things in lumberyard are going to be split down into good quality, relatively quarter sawn, as opposed to the lesser quality flat sawn lumber that's going to want to bend a bit more on you. So understand that's kind of what you're looking for. And you're going to get some quarter sawn that really isn't all that good. The rings kind of curl through it and it's only quarter sawn on one face. So you need to be picky. Even when you're looking through an actual quarter sawn pile, make sure that your quarter sawn lumber gives you the raise you're looking for or gives you the stability you're looking for. Because everyone has slightly different ways of naming things and everyone thinks their way is right, and then you're going to get into arguments, and just spend some time to dig through the pile and find what you're looking for. So I hope now you kind of understand a little bit of how wood moves. It's not one of these magical, mythical things like, ooh, no, it might just move. And I've got a lot more videos actually going to deeper dives into wood movement. It's one of those things that that's just how the wood works. And if you understand the mechanics of it, you can understand how that actually affects your particular piece of lumber. And then you can figure out how that particular piece of lumber is going to fit into the project you're working on. So understanding the basics help you make better furniture. If you do have any questions, thoughts, ideas, throw those in the comments down below. I do read through all of them and I answer as many of those as I can get to. And really, that actually helps out the channel. Anytime you hit questions and comments down there, or you hit the like, share, subscribe, or even the thank you button, thank you. Helps us get in front of more people, helps the channel grow. You know how it works. But if you want to go even farther, there are a bunch of names over here. Those are all patrons on Patreon, and those people are absolutely amazing. Without patrons or members, people who've clicked the little join button down below, we wouldn't be here. We are completely sponsored by you guys. And without you, we wouldn't be here. So if you'd like to help keep the lights on and keep us going, then think about becoming a patron on Patreon and helping us with that. I think that'll do it for now. And until next time, have a wonderful day. So now that you understand your cuts of lumber, tune in with us next time while we talk about cuts of meat and cheese. And now I'm getting hungry.